After fixing an alien flying craft on my property, I saw something that would change everything you think you know about Jesus' return. The words left James's mouth in a breathless half-laugh he didn't feel, standing barefoot on the dew-dark grass as the object cooled like a metal star and the air around it smelled faintly of ozone and pine sap. The hull hummed, an almost organic vibration that reached into the bones. For a man who had spent 40 years listening to engines and whispers of systems no one else understood, the sound felt like recognition. He had not planned any of this. The retired colonel had chosen solitude the way some men choose prayer, as a practical shelter from the noise of orders and committees, a place where he kept tools like heirlooms and a shed full of schematics. His neighbors knew him as a taciturn man who could coax life back into anything with a piston and a soldering iron. They didn't know him as the kind who would walk into the woods at dawn to meet a craft that fell from a sky without a trace. The sky that night had gone black in a way that tasted metallic. Grid lines of the county died in sequence. The house lights blinked, then nothing. James's generator had been quiet for years, a pair of batteries that never saw use. He grabbed his flashlight, thumbed it on, and followed the scent, an electric flower opening beyond the pines. He found the hull half buried in a shallow hollow, as if the earth itself had exhaled and accepted the visitor. The craft was not the smooth, reflective disk of tabloids. It wore armor like a living shell, sections of glassy crystal threaded with filaments that pulsed with slow, cool blue. One of those crystals had cracked, a seam that emitted a high harmonic James felt in his teeth. An inside voice traced old flight manuals and emergency protocols. He knelt and, without thinking, his hands already beginning the old maps of stress and resonance, he set to work. There is a kind of labor that strips any performance from a man, the hands-only rhythm of a mechanic. James moved through it like someone coming home. He cleaned the fracture with an alcohol that smelled of rosemary and something else, sea and iron, and began to refit the filaments. He tuned the crystal to an odd frequency, a number he instinctively felt was right, 528 hertz, a resonance he'd once heard referenced in a college paper and later dismissed in briefings as pseudoscience. Under the glass, when the frequency matched, the hull sang a tiny octave, and the crack knit with the ease of a well-plated seam. Tools clanged, the night held its breath. When the seam's glow steadied, a panel sighed open and light laid itself across James's calloused fingers. A shape leaned forward from the interior, articulate and elegant, eyes like slow suns folding in on themselves. It didn't move with the clumsy anthropomorphic gestures of film aliens. Seer was not a caricature of human design, but something older, shaped by conditions James had never been trained to imagine. Limbs that telescoped, a voice that drummed in the vertebrae rather than the ear. It kept its head inclined in a posture James read as gratitude. The first words were not words spoken aloud. They arrived as a sparking impression against the back of his skull, a three-part communication, an image of a wounded landscape, a name, simple and bright, and a sequence of data like a map. James could have panicked. Instead, practical habit translated the shock into inventory. The creature's right flank bore lacerations. Fluid coagulation suggested an immune mechanism different from mammalian clotting. Seer's respiration was shallow. It needed repair more than explanation. They worked in silence that was not empty. The craft's interior smelled of warm metals and a faint herbal vapor. Seer presented a panel of memory stones, small crystalline discs etched with spirals, and placed one against James's palm. The contact pressed the image of a library into him. Corridors of light, holographic shelves, a record archive that recorded events across 1,000 or more worlds with the neutrality of a ledger. "You want help," the impression said. "We offer records." It was an exchange older than barter. James patched arterial tubing with a strip of his own shirt, fashioned compresses from the medicinal herbs growing in a tin at the cutting bench, and waited until the alien's breathing broadened and steadied. When he finally sat back and surveyed the job,
filaments refitted, seals reinforced. The craft hummed at a lower pitch, a satisfying thrum like a well-lubricated gear. Sear's eyes unfurled like maps. The creature extended something like a limb, and, through the field by which they communicated, offered James access. A single record, a projection, a contained archive meant for one who had saved a life. "I don't know if I should," James heard himself thinking, in his own voice, the only one audible among flickers of star sheen and electrical hush. He saw his life in a moment. The hangar bay, the memorial plaques, the quiet kitchen where his daughter visited and spoke of grandchildren he had not yet met. To whom would he announce this? Neighbors? Old colleagues? He had spent his career managing classified truths, returning from deployments with the sense that some facts belonged only to the quiet corridors of government and to men who understood the cost of noise. Sear answered as if it understood classification. The projection opened with the delicacy of someone offering a book at the right page. "Records can be shown," the impression said. "We do not judge use." James let the craft lead him. He had the curiosity of a man who had always wired itself to solutions. The projection was not a film on a screen, but a shift in space. The air in front of him thickened with bluish light. The world tilted toward a new horizon.
He had patched together enough fragile things to accept one more mystery. The image resolved into a city, Jerusalem, but not as print or paint. The projection layered textures, stone baked by sun, the sharp smell of animal sweat, the copper tang of a nearby market. Voices came as striated tones, not discrete words, and James read meaning from cadence and posture. He watched the receding back of a man known to history as Jesus of Nazareth, the projection taking care to present names only as tags within the archive: the Nazarene, Mary, Longinus, Joseph. The record allowed distance, a way to view what humans had invested in centuries of language and myth. It was in this first archive that James saw planning, or what the record labeled as planning. A cluster of scenes centered not on divine providence as the Gospels render it in their liturgical brilliance, but on measured human choices, medical, tactical, emotional. The record did not whisper that myth was false or true. It simply showed coordination. The projection's vignettes were precise. They revealed the Nazarene, lean, weathered, his face carrying the exhaustion of someone who had walked miles preaching, who had spoken in parables while also attending to the practical work of community. Beside him in many scenes stood a woman whose presence in the public accounts had been coded in a dozen ways over centuries. According to the record shown to James, Mary, the figure the archive labels as caretaker and partner, moved with the kind of authority that belongs to someone who knows wounds intimately, a caregiver who administered oils, compresses, and instructions with a calm that invited execution. Among the projection's attendants was Longinus, a Roman centurion whose role the record framed as both pragmatic and moral. In the archive's language, his position at the event combined duty and an awareness that spectacle could be weaponized. Joseph of Arimathea appeared not as a cameo, but as orchestrator, in the logistical sense. The acquisition of a tomb that was guarded not by secrecy alone, but by deliberate security measures meant to preserve not a corpse, but a person in a state of deep shock and trauma. James watched the record unspool the medical anatomy in a way that left no room for theatrics. The spear, Longinus's instrument in most retellings, was shown to have a specific purpose, a controlled puncture intended to release pericardial fluid, so that the heart would decrease pressure and enter a kind of stasis that could be medically supported. In the archive's rendering, this was not an act of desecration, but a clinical intervention performed with the awareness of anatomical consequence. Among the projection's attendants was Longinus, a Roman centurion whose role the record framed as both pragmatic and moral. In the archive's language, his position at the event combined duty and an awareness that spectacle could be weaponized.
Joseph of Arimathea appeared not as a cameo, but as orchestrator in the logistical sense. The acquisition of a tomb that was guarded not by secrecy alone, but by deliberate security measures meant to preserve not a corpse, but a person in a state of deep shock and trauma. James watched the record unspool the medical anatomy in a way that left no room for theatrics. The spear, Longinus's instrument in most retellings, was shown to have a specific purpose, a controlled puncture intended to release pericardial fluid, so that the heart would decrease pressure and enter a kind of stasis that could be medically supported. In the archive's rendering, this was not an act of desecration, but a clinical intervention performed with the awareness of anatomical consequence. The record labeled each step in technical clarity, and then, as if honoring what it showed, let its light move to the next frame. The hurried retrieval of the body from the cross, the unwrapping and the packing of chest and limbs with herbal salves that in the projection read as antiseptic agents. Powders and oils described in the archive's annotation as advanced for their environment. James, whose hands had just fixed filaments and sutured a wound in another world, felt the weight of professional recognition. The projection provided a kind of forensic plainness to the scenes. It was not trying to deny what people had felt in cathedrals for 2 millennia. Instead, the record offered a parallel language to describe the same events, one steeped in tactics and survival. The translation did not reduce the tenderness of grief. On the contrary, seeing Mary, whose presence the projection insisted on identifying in detail, bending over bandages and reciting what the record framed as nursing protocols, made the human cost sharper. But the record also laid bare the choices of narrative. It showed apostles as individuals interpreting what they witnessed through the lens of their faith and trauma. Peter's fury, John's confusion, Thomas's skepticism. The archive's holographic captions suggested how these responses would be reconstructed into what later cultures called testimony. The projection did not pretend to erase the meaning those communities had constructed. It only added a sheet of granular detail under the painting. A parallel account that, if taken at face value, reframed resurrection not as sudden reanimation from the dead, but as a survival operation followed by strategic narrative formation. James recoiled, then leaned forward, the old reflex of a man saved from static. Treat the data, not the emotion. The projection's neutrality only made his own emotion sharper. He had grown up in a world where institutional memory was as sacred as the wooden pew his mother had used. To see a tradition's sacred drama mapped against antiseptic oil and guarded tombs felt like witnessing the skeleton of a beloved hymn. But the skeleton held muscle and breath in the archive's light. He thought of the practical implications first, the military habit intramind. If the Nazarene had indeed been kept in a state of induced stasis and guarded for recovery, then whoever had arranged for the tomb and the bandaging had to have had both resources and risk calculation. Joseph of Arimathea, with his access and leverage, could have arranged the logistics. Longinus, with a centurion's command, could align timing with the procession. Mary, recast in the projection as both spouse and caregiver, would be the human center who ensured fidelity to the plan. The document did not pretend to moral clarity. It simply presented the sequence, and James's operational mind read it like a field report. He thought, in a sudden flash, of how movements have always needed stories. Whether told by state bureaucracy or by zealots in a market square, narratives are the scaffolding that holds communities together. The projection acknowledged this. It showed small meetings that became bigger meetings. It recorded the choices leaders made about what to say, when to withhold, and how to frame the loss. In one sequence, the record labeled as commentary the decision to let the public face believe the miraculous, that a man had died and risen. Because mythology, the archive seemed to tacitly concede, could galvanize people in ways sober truth sometimes could not. The projection did not moralize, it merely noted outcomes. James had been a colonel who knew how narratives could be constructed to preserve order in the moment. In Afghanistan, he had watched commanders shape language to keep a coalition together without revealing sources of intelligence. He had also understood the ethical danger in that craft, the way truth shaded under expedience. The projections record folded these familiar problems into a new context, and the familiarity made his chest tighten. Where his training had taught him to weigh civilian cost against strategic gain, the archive scenes forced him to imagine entire centuries living under a story possibly shaped as much by survival strategy as by celestial miracle. The projection let the viewer linger on small human images: Mary tending a wound, a child's hand, tagged by the archive as Sarah, finding the hem of a cloak, the Nazarene sleeping not in a tomb as a finality, but in a guarded space that smelled of balm. The record was careful with names and with reverence. It did not depict scandal so much as reveal that someone had made an impossible choice and then circled the consequences like a shepherd protecting sheep. In the projections archive, the question of why was not answered with novelty alone, but with practical motive, a future claim, subtle and almost programmatic, about preventing future violence. James watched a scene where a figure in clothing that did not belong to the first century, something like modern fabric, a modern watch glinting, met with a man the record labeled as the Nazarene. The visitor's gestures mapped out a plan in the projections overlay: avoid martyrdom that would produce empire-building zealotry, preserve the seed of teachings by keeping their human vessel alive. The image of temporal intervention flicked like a wormhole. The archive's note on that frame read, with a somber neutrality, "Mitigation advised." James felt his jaw go tight. The colonel in him detected the operational signature of someone trained to insert correction into dangerous feedback loops. The projection framed it as an act of ethical intervention, someone from a later time, believing that the martyr narrative might become a weapon in wars yet to come, advised survivability over spectacle. The archive did not sanctify the visitor as prophet, it marked them as participant.
The record's language suggested contingency, not command. There was a sound then in the craft's interior, the soft click of a relay closing, and James realized he had been holding his breath. Sears' presence in the cabin was patient but full of expectation. The projection continued, luminous and unblinking, as if the craft's archive had discovered in him a listener who still knew how to handle responsibility. That was when James felt the moral pressure. If the record was true within its own archive logic, what then was duty for a man who had been shown it? He could file it away as astounding fiction. He could bury it like the classified briefs in his old desk. He could run to the local news and unleash chaos. He knew the patterns of disclosure and the patterns of suppression. The craft's light did not tell him what to decide, but the projection showed the human cost of choices. A small and simple scene arrived like a cut paper image. Mary holding Sarah close while the Nazarene, wrapped in a cloth that the record annotated as pressure compressive bandaging, listened to a whisper. The archive did not include their private words in full. Instead, it rendered them as impressions, attenuated, intimate. The projection respected certain boundaries. Private speech internal to the subject was rendered as blur, while public decisions and recorded actions were clear. That care made James feel that the archive had ethics, a protocol about what to expose. It had allowed him to witness events without voyeurism. James had grown up in churches on the fringe of Basetown bars. He had sat through midnight vigils and responsibilities, and he knew that faith and human ingenuity have always braided together. The projection's careful depiction of Mary's labor, both medical and maternal, exposed an erasure James recognized from other histories. The sidelining of female labor in the narratives posterity remembers. The record did more than restart a debate about resurrection. It pointed a bright light at voices that history had folded into margins. For James, this felt like a moral restitution. He did not immediately think of millions of believers. He thought of Sarah's small fingers circling a bandage, and of how ordinary love sometimes became the axis of extraordinary events. That human image kept him tethered. The archive's projection offered enough details to be scandalous, and yet it did so with a kind of restraint that felt almost compassionate. It showed choices without slander. It showed human beings doing the best they could in a violent world. When the projection shifted to the tomb, it annotated the scene as recovery space guarded. That line did more than mark logistics. It reframed the tomb's architecture. The record showed men carrying the body not with ritualistic slowness, but with urgent competence. A stretcher fashioned to keep pressure consistent. Herbs placed to prevent infection. Watchmen posted to disguise the real purpose. The archive's gaze was clinical, yet tender. James found himself whispering, part awe, part a soldier's inventory, of the antiseptic qualities of certain oils, of bandaging methods that leave the patient most likely to survive, of the timing of removing a spear to allow circulation to resume slowly rather than violently. He understood the choreography because his hands had rehearsed it in mechanics angles, and because his mind had been trained to see action in frames. The archive was not making a theological argument. It was presenting a sequence. James could step back into faith and say with equal sincerity that miracles and human ingenuity are not mutually exclusive. The projection did not say they were. It merely recorded. Hours later, hours measured in the craft's slow breathing and in James's narrowed attention, the projection concluded its first act. The light retracted like a tide. The archive stepped back, leaving James alone with the hum of the repaired hull and the night full of secrets. He stayed where he was, palms resting on the cooling crystal, and felt the enormity of responsibility weigh like wet wool. The projection had given him not verdicts, but vantage points. It had not declared institutions immoral. It had shown processes and choices that produce narratives. It had shown the people, the caregivers, the guards, the men who calculated risk, who had shaped an event into the tradition millions now revered. James kept thinking of the centurion Longinus and the controlled puncture. He thought of Mary's hands and Sarah's small head against a shoulder. These were not characters in a story designed for scandal. They were persons whose names the archive preserved with care. He did not know yet what he would do with what he had seen. The practical man in him cataloged a list, secure the hull, document the archive within the craft's guidelines, decide whether to ask for more. The moral man cataloged another, weigh the consequences of disclosure, consider the ripple effects, remember his old training about how a single revealed fact can topple institutions or heal wounds. When at last he rose and closed the craft's panel, Seer watched him with something like patience. The creature's presence felt like a quiet insistence that the record required an interpreter, not a judge. James had been given evidence within a narrative universe. Now he was tasked with what to do with a truth that could be understood in a dozen different ways. He walked back to his bungalow under a sky that had returned to its ordinary, indifferent scatter of stars. His workshop smelled of oil and pine. Tools on the bench looked like the bones of a long life. He brewed coffee without tasting it and sat by a window while the projection's images replayed behind his eyes. The archive's light had burned into him a new lens. The question that kept returning was not a question of historical fact, but of meaning. If resurrection, if the event the projection recorded as survival rather than miraculous reanimation, could be described as a strategic preservation, what did that change about how people sought transformation? James's inner voice, older and steadier than the one that had spoken on the lawn, asked a different kind of question. What if resurrection is less about a single event and more about a process we can live? He thought to himself. The projection had concluded that the Nazarene lived on,
taught elsewhere, and eventually died a natural death in anonymity. That suggested a model of transformation unbound from spectacle, a sustained life of teaching woven into the fabric of ordinary existence. He slept fitfully. Dreams arrived like the craft's projection had, not as literal visions, but as tonal impressions. In them, he saw a room of people gathered not for a miracle, but for a lesson, about sovereignty, about reclaiming the small authority available to each heart. He woke with a residue of the archive's soft moral challenge: disclosure without harm, truth without demolition, seeds planted quietly to grow in patient soil. The next morning, the county grid remained stubbornly whole. The world turned as if nothing had breached its peace. James roused before dawn and walked out to the hollow. The hull was smaller in daylight, less like a fallen star and more like an elegantly formed instrument. Seer had left a mark under one of the panels, a simple spiral of light that pulsed when he touched it. The craft's memory stones hummed against his palm. The archive had offered him one record. There could be more. There would be questions about authority, about the sanctity of narrative, about how human institutions take stories and shape them into power. There would be people who would not want his silence, and people who would fear his voice. For now, the choice was his. Before he left the site, his thumb brushed the stone that had shown him Jerusalem. He did not yet understand whether the real consequence of the projection was historical revision or spiritual reorientation. He only knew that in his hands, the record felt less like a weapon and more like an instrument. If the archive had given him a map, the terrain beyond the map would demand patience. Back in the kitchen, he set down a short note on a paper towel. Do not publish, consult. He postmarked the safe habits of a man who knew the value of discretion. Outside, the wind moved the pines like a congregation in slow benediction. Inside, the relic of the craft hummed in the box under his workbench, a promise that the projection could be summoned again. It was then he made a decision that would shape the next weeks. He would not run to the local press, and he would not scream from the rooftops. Instead, he would learn the craft's protocols and ask the archive for clarification.
He would plant ideas like seeds rather than artillery. The projection had shown him how institutions had taken narratives and reified them. James's instinct was to counter that by insisting on small, human-scale sharing. 2 days later, after careful study and hours of coaxing the craft's interface, James asked Seer for another record. The alien's impressions flickered, a question of consent, a projection of ethical parameters. Seer, in its odd and patient way, mapped the archival rules about exposure. What could be shown wholly, what was restricted, what would fragment the social fabric if released wholesale. The craft's memory had protocols. The projection seemed to suggest that the alien archive had previously intervened sparsely on Earth, offering counsel to those who could interpret and steward the material. James listened to the archive's cautions and felt, beneath them, an insistence on responsibility. He had been invited into a custodial role. The weight of that invitation lay heavy and quiet in his chest. When at last the craft opened another memory, the projection did not return to the public scenes immediately. It instead offered a smaller frame, a kitchen lit with candlelight and a small child asleep against a woman's shoulder. Sarah, shown again as an anchor to the human family at the center of the record. The archive zoomed inward into gestures of care and whispered instruction, moments that would never make it into the public sermons and yet formed the axis of teaching. Love enacted over years, repetition without glory, lessons taught by hands rather than by vacant pronouncements. The projector's light thinned and elongated, and James realized he was not watching an exposé. He was watching a human story, a man who survived, a woman who loved, a child who played at feet that would later leave footprints in other lands. The archive's framing suggested a different kind of resurrection, one that unfolded over decades rather than on a Sunday morning.
James left the craft with his head full of tactical images and his heart full of quiet mortal compassion. He had been given a record that reframed a central event of faith, but the record also insisted on dignity toward those who lived it. It showed people making choices in a violent world, not abstract players on a cosmic chessboard. For James, the revelation, if that is the word his neighbors would use, didn't reduce the sacred. It humanized it. He would have to decide, in time, how widely to plant the seeds the archive offered. He had long ago learned that a single fact, dropped carelessly, could topple cities of meaning. He also had seen how a small truth, carefully shared, could revive a life. He kept the memory stone in a felt pouch and, in the evenings, read the projections again with a slow and reverent curiosity.
Each replay illuminated different details. The exact way a bandage was folded, the scent of an oil described with a botanical precision that surprised him, the cadence of a private teaching that the archive only hinted at. He began to understand that what the craft carried was not a single bullet of truth, but a trunk of possible understandings. He would have to choose which branches to water. On the fifth night after the repair, the projection returned with a different intensity. The craft's archive had decided, apparently, that James was ready for a closer view. The light pooled like a basin. The city resolved again, but this time the record's camera fell closer to the cross, focusing with a merciless clarity on the moment the spear would be used. James felt his stomach hollow as the frame approached. He had seen the medical annotations before, the purpose of the puncture, the expected physiological response. But seeing the motion in real time, Longinus moving with the detached precision of a man carrying out orders while also weighing the life under his hand, made the detail unbearable in a new way. The archive's projection did not dramatize. It showed the mechanics, how the instrument entered, how the rush of fluid signaled a heart's changing dynamics, how the hands that carried the body later moved with the steady competence of men who had planned for this contingency. The projection then shifted with a speed that felt like a closing door. It cut to the tomb's interior, bandages, herbs, the hush of watchmen. Mary hovered like a lighthouse. Joseph's hands arranged the linens with the care of an artisan. The archive's annotation called the tomb a recovery room and marked the hours that followed as stabilization period. The light thinned again. Sayre's interior hum felt like a metronome. James realized, in a way that had the physical prickliness of cold water, that the story he had always been told and the sequence the archive showed were not mutually exclusive. The projection suggested they were overlapping vistas, story and survival braided in a way no single tradition had fully captured. The archive's record, within its own bounds, offered him an account that begged 1,000 more questions. He was not ready to answer them. He was, however, ready to go deeper. And as the projection's light dimmed and the hall settled into a patient hum, James sat alone on his porch and watched the horizon grow pale. The booklet of memory stones lay in his pocket like a small, heavy creed. He turned the possibilities in his mind like a man turning a key in the lock of a very old door. He had saved a life by fixing a craft. He had been given access to a record that reframed one of history's pivotal myths. He had pledged, in a small note folded into his wallet, to be cautious. But in the marrow of him, trained by duty, softened by decades of watching small lives bloom, something was stirring. The projection had not offered him a verdict. It had offered him a mission, to learn how to plant seeds that might grow into something like resurrection, not as spectacle, but as the slow reclaiming of human authority over spiritual destiny. The craft hummed softly in the hollow. The world continued to turn. The choice was now James's to steward. He kept the memory stone in his palm until the dawn grew a little more stubborn, until the porch light bled away with the night. The craft's memory hummed under the bench in the workshop like an animal sleeping in the dark. James tasted coffee on his tongue and the residue of archive light behind his eyes. He had pledged discretion, and yet the projection's images would not fold themselves back into the neat compartment he'd once reserved for classified files. Something else nudged, an obligation that felt less like secrecy and more like stewardship. If you want to see more accounts like this and to follow what James would do next, subscribe and hit the bell. There are other records, and you'll want to hear them as he does, slowly, reverently, and with judgment. The craft's archive answered when he asked for more, but it did so with restraint. Sayre's impressions were careful. The machine had rules. The next record the craft offered was not a broad sweep, but a set of close-up appearances and private moments. Scenes where the public story and the intimate life braided together in ways that, within the archive, illuminated motive as much as method. The projection showed post-tomb scenes as annotated fragments. Wakeful rooms where Peter and John argued doctrine in the low light. Thomas fingering his way past disbelief into a skepticism that felt human rather than heretical. An appearance in which an exhausted Nazarene sat at a table and let people touch him, allow the apostles to reconcile the image of death with the warm presence before them. The archive marked these as interpretive contact, and it rendered the tactile moments as both real and ambiguous. Hands pressing into shoulders, a hand feeling a scar that might be a scar, or might be the memory of anguish. In one of the closer frames, the projection allowed Mary, clearly labeled in the archive as caregiver and wife, to sit at the edge of a healing pallet. She spoke softly into the record's aura, not in sentences the archive reproduced, but in tonal impressions. Lullabies, meals prepared carefully, the repetitive gestures of wound care that are themselves a kind of teaching. Sarah, shown as a girl with dust-dark hair and a hand always near her mother's wrist, moved through those scenes like a talisman of ordinary life. The archive's notes suggested that these domestic hours formed the backbone of teaching that later public orations couldn't contain. Lessons of patience, of embodied mercy, of discipline given through fingers and not only through words. The record showed apostles encountering the Nazarene after the tomb with a mixture of wonder and cognitive fracture. In the archive's reconstruction, some of their stories were attempts to interpret the apparent impossibility they had witnessed. Peter is seen arguing fiercely, his voice rendered as a striated rhythm, about the need for a galvanizing narrative that could unify followers. John is softer in projection, more devoted to preserving memory than to constructing myth. The record annotated these as emergent narratives, the raw material from which public testimony would be forged. Those documentary captions were the archive's way of showing process, a group of people experiencing a shock and, out of that shock, making meaning. The projection's neutrality reminded James of his own job in the military. Take chaos, shape it into an intelligible report, and thereby make it survivable. In the archive, both motives, the pastoral and the strategic, overlapped. The record did not diminish faith. It rendered how faith and strategy could cohabit a single human enterprise. Later, the projection slid into sequences that showed the teaching continued, but carefully and away from centers of power. The Nazarene is portrayed traveling in small circuits after the recovery, teaching more in fragmented communities than in grand assemblies. The archive labeled this dispersal strategy. He preached in markets and caravanways, in kitchens and by riversides where small groups could listen without the threat of spectacle. The projection suggested that the life that followed was less about a single miraculous overturning of death than a prolonged, messy work of repair, emotional, social, and doctrinal. Then the record delivered the meeting that had weighed on James's mind in the first projection, the visitor in modern clothes whose presence the archive marked as anachronistic, but whose motives were clear in the projection's overlay. The scene was quiet, no fanfare. A figure wearing fabric that did not belong to the first century, a wrist with a simple band or a reflective watch face that caught the light like a star, approached in the hush of a night road and spoke to the Nazarene. The archive annotated the visitor as temporal mitigator advisory. According to the record, the visitor's counsel was precise.
Avoid martyrdom as a tool for creating empire-building zeal. Preserve the teacher to let teachings propagate in ways that might reduce the future violence that martyrs' cults sometimes engender. The projection did not sanctify this intervention, it recorded it as an ethical calculation made by someone who had knowledge of later consequences. For James, the modern signature on the fabric and the watch face's glint felt like the most human element, someone who had looked forward, feared the arc of history, and decided to nudge it. The archive's overlay suggested motives born not of hubris, but of calculation, an attempt, according to the record, at a kind of damage control. The visitor's gestures mapped instruction, how to appear dead enough to convince observers, where to allow a controlled puncture without causing fatal hemorrhage, how to ensure a guarded custody that would not permit opportunistic desecration. The meeting ended with a plan. Let the public interpret the story as resurrection. Let small circles keep the practical truths that made the survival possible. In the archive's voice, the visitor's aim was mitigation. Minimize future tragedies that could be fueled by martyrdom margin mythologies. The images of flight followed in the projection's chronology. The archive recorded a hush of departure from Jerusalem, nighttime movements, cover stories, the sponsorship of friends with access and money. Joseph of Arimathea's logistical strength appears again in these frames. Horses swaddled with bedding, chests of simple clothes, and a route toward Egypt coded in the projection as escape and reconstruction. Mary, bearing Sarah, is meticulous in the traveling frames. How to carry herbs, which foods travel best, packing what keeps wounds from reopening. The archive annotated the family's movement as relocation for convalescence. The projection traced further, with a kind of cartography of teaching, into landscapes beyond the Roman orbit. Egypt appears as a place of anonymity and refuge. Markets smell of cumin and river mud. Teachers of many faiths move and trade knowledge in the back rooms of caravan inns. The Nazarene is shown there not as an itinerant prophet on a pedestal, but as a man who quietly conversed with other traditions, exchanged methods of healing, and listened to local wisdom. The archive's annotations framed this as an exchange of practical approaches, medicinal protocols, narrative methods for surviving persecution, and the subtle art of teaching that resists institutional co-optation. From Egypt, the projection's path bends toward the east. The archive's records show journeys that may have reached regions beyond the familiar. In certain frames, men with robes of differing cut, suggestive of Indian subcontinent styles, move through the periphery of scenes. The archive's notes are cautious. It avoids grand claims about specific cities or tombstones, and instead offers impressions. Dialogues across traditions, techniques of meditation, and the transfer of embodied practices. The projection's language here is tentative, as if the archive itself sensed the dangers of overreach in what it recorded. The later frames, moved by the archive's slow hand, show a life of teaching that stretches decades rather than days. The Nazarene ages in the projection. Lines deepen, hands steady with practice rather than with pain, a laughter that is quieter but fuller. The record marks a sequence of years where the man lives and teaches in anonymity. No monuments, no fanfare, before eventually dying a natural death at an age that places him within ordinary mortality. The archive's notes emphasize the normalcy. Death by old age, attended by a small circle, buried with the tenderness a family affords. Within the archive's data set, this life beyond the cross does not nullify the movement that grew in the wake of those events. It complicates it. The projection shows communities forming around testimony and memory, combining public proclamation with small private practices. Apostles carry forward public narratives that inspire mass devotion, while beneath those narratives, other threads, Mary's teachings, private practices, and the Nazarene's own quieter method, travel through circles that the archive suggests were often erased by later institutional consolidations. Here, the record's most sensitive annotations appear. The archive presents a map of institutional consolidation. decisions, gatherings, and editorial shifts that the record marks as canonization processes. It frames these shifts as the ordinary work of communities organizing in order to survive and to translate complex teachings into understandable creeds. But the archive also indicates that within those processes, certain voices were sidelined. Mary's central role, according to the projection's annotation, became diminished in official recounting. The record suggests that some teachings, more amenable to hierarchical structures, were amplified, while others, particularly those privileging feminine authority or interiors of mystical practice, were relegated to margins. James watched these frames with the unease of a man who had watched strategies become bureaucracy. The archive's reproductions of councils and editorial scribes were careful to note that selection is a human act. Choices made over several gatherings, selections of which letters to emphasize, which oral accounts to enshrine, and which local traditions to smooth into a uniform voice. The projection's caption stopped short of verdict. Within its archive logic, they were observations. But to a man who had seen strategic narratives stabilized into institutions, they read like a map of how spiritual power can congeal into structures that privilege certain voices over others. The projection also included quieter frames of alternative communities that kept other strands alive. Small groups preserving practices of inner work, prayer forms that emphasized personal sovereignty, and teachings transmitted through domestic lines, often through women whose names seldom made it into official lists. The archive labeled these gatherings living transmissions, not lesser but less visible to the apparatus of empire and less amenable to centralization. James felt a sympathetic tug. These scenes echoed the way grassroots networks in his own era had kept resilience alive without the fanfare of a headline. The craft's archive included pages of caution about disclosure.
In one recorded annotation, explicit and stark, the archive relayed prior interventions on other worlds where wholesale disclosure had produced social collapse. The record included a case study projection, a sudden release of a destabilizing truth that had precipitated violent factionalism. Within the archive's logic, Sabir's species had learned patterns of intervention, the difference between offering a seed and dropping a bomb. The craft's memory had rules. James, who had read them and adhered to them now for practical reasons, felt the moral gravity of the craft's restraint. This was not secrecy for secrecy's sake, but an act of prudence calibrated to human fragility. James's processing slid between professional cadence and private sentiment. Professionally, he cataloged the risks, the upheaval that might occur if a record like this were broadcast unmoored to context, the way institutions could weaponize fragments to consolidate or to blackmail, the way ancient texts might be used as hammers to batter people into one orthodoxy or another. Privately, he felt the ache of human compassion. What would it do to the descendants of believers to learn an account that complicated their deepest hopes? Would it free them or break them? The archive had not told him to choose. It had shown him the stakes. His nights turned to a new kind of labor. He kept one memory stone close and asked the craft questions that were less about facts and more about ethics. How did the archive prefer its records to be stewarded? What had happened on other worlds where revelation met human volatility? Sabir's impressions suggested a pattern. Small disclosure, context attached, a long cultivation of understanding. The craft's memory seemed to desire an interpreter who would not only reveal, but who would prepare soil. It was in that posture James began to plant seeds. He did so with the specificity of a man who knew the difference between a broadcast and a whisper. He chose listeners by small signs. A neighbor who sat at the hardware store and lingered on stories of moral courage. An old friend named Tom who now taught a night class at the community college. A woman named Layla who ran the local hospice and who routinely bore witness to the dignity of dying. He spoke to them not of archives or aliens at first, but of ideas that had framed the projection. Resurrection as a prolonged return to wholeness rather than a single astronomical event. The dignity of caregiving as theology.
and the notion that spiritual authority could be lived in small, practical habits. When he finally offered fragments of the projection to one or two of them, he prefaced the sharing with the archive's voice. "According to the record I was shown." He never announced it as proof, only as a narrative that invited reflection. Tom, who had once been a skeptical artillery sergeant before becoming a philosophy teacher, listened like a man who had spent a life weighing competing testimonies.
Layla, who had held hands in hospice rooms, found in the projection an affirmation that the work of caretaking had always been theological, even if it had not always been named so. These conversations did not produce newsletters or viral videos. They made small ripples. Tom began to assign readings in his class that questioned how institutions consolidate doctrines. Students who were believers found the discussion jarring but stimulating. Layla, in a meeting of hospice volunteers, began to teach a short ritual of presence she had learned from James's description of Mary's bedside methods. Simple breaths, material tenderness, a recounting of life's practical redemptions. The ripple became a practice in the hospice. Families who had never spoken of spiritual agency found a way to name gentle sovereignty. James's stewardship took the form of a slow pedagogy. He taught people how to hold complicated stories without weaponizing them. He emphasized 3 protocols he had derived from the craft's own rules. Context. Offer testimony with background, not as a bludgeon. Care. Center those who live within the story rather than abstract them. And consent. Ask if the person you speak to wants to engage. He taught these as practices that could be learned and lived. In doing so, he modeled the archive's ethos. Reveal, but do not destabilize. The projection also kept visiting him in dreams, lucid sequences the craft had promised would continue. These dreams were not cinematic replays, but tonal impressions. The smell of oils, hands that did work, the feeling of being seen into. Sometimes they arrived as a push, wake and remember to be tender. Other times they arrived as instructive fragments. A bandage folded in a particular way, a breath count for pain management, a phrase for calming a small child's fear. The dreams were, in the archive's language, continued pedagogy, and James treated them as homework. A small episode made the stakes palpable. In a clinic run by a missionary group in a neighboring county, a young man named Raphael, quiet, with a face weathered by hard work, came in with an injury that had been infected for too long. The wound required not only medical attention, but an ethic of care that honored Raphael's dignity. James, at Layla's request, came to demonstrate a dressing technique he had seen in the projection, a method that combined pressure compressive wraps with topical herbs. The technique was not miraculous, it was practical. The wound healed more quickly than expected, and Raphael later told the clinic volunteers that the care had made him feel like someone's life mattered. News of the technique spread slowly, in a way that carried the seeds the archive had advised. These small tendrils of influence were precisely what the craft's memory imagined as responsible disclosure. The archive had suggested that living proof, embodied practices that improve a person's life, could carry transformative credence without turning into a spectacle that institutions might co-opt. James began to see the projection's spiritual pivot not as an attack on belief, but as an invitation. If resurrection could be imagined as a process of reauthoring one's life, then the work of resurrection could be practiced in daily acts, healing a wound, teaching a humility of power, taking responsibility for one's narrative. This reframing came to a head in James's own inner life. The projection had shown him the Nazarene not as someone whose significance hinged on an abrupt supernatural reversal, but as someone whose influence spilled into years of quiet pedagogy. The idea settled into him like a seed. His own life, once dominated by the language of orders and comms, had space now for a different grammar, the language of stewardship, of restoration, and of careful revelation. He practiced small rites. A morning acknowledgement of what he would steward that day, a minute of breath with a neighbor before a difficult conversation, a refusal to speak larger truths to those unprepared. He taught others to do the same, and watched with a slow astonishment how ordinary people began to articulate a private sovereignty, the courage to decide for themselves what they would hold sacred and what they would set down. Word, however, is a weathered thing. It finds leakage points. A young man who heard fragments in Tom's class began to blog about the idea of a resurrection as process and titled his post provocatively. The essay attracted attention beyond the county. Messages began to come. Some were curious and earnest, others were outraged, accusing James, unnamed in the posts, of historical revisionism if not outright blasphemy. James felt the tug of old reflexes, to shut down, to file hard copies into locked drawers. He thought of the craft's warning about disclosure running ahead of cultivation. He responded, as the craft had counseled, by doubling down on context. He wrote an essay, careful, annotated, and framed from the start as an account of what he had been shown within the archive's projection. He did not claim proof. He offered a narrative and a practice, a way to live resurrection that did not require a rewrite of every believer's doctrinal map, but did invite an embodied daily reclaiming of agency. The piece circulated slowly. Some readers found solace, others found confusion. James endured the turbulence with a steadying patience born of long service. This was the craft's design, to test whether human beings could steward a destabilizing testimony with prudence. In the months that followed, James continued to ask for projections in measures, not torrents. Each time, the archive rewarded his patience with frames that emphasized the ordinary, teachings carried via kinship networks, recipes of salves with botanical notes, moments when Mary's authority was expressed through management of a household economy as much as the rhetoric. A particular projection altered James's understanding of the relationship between public movement and private preservation. The archive showed a scene of a small community, decades after the Nazarene's death, gathered in a simple room where a woman, whose name the archive rendered as Miriam in a later dialectal footnote, taught the younger generation a set of practices for internal sovereignty. A three-part routine of breathing, contemplative reframing of personal narratives, and the daily tenderness of accountability. The projection annotated this as lived resurrection. It was not spectacular. It was sustainable. This became James's favorite phrase, lived resurrection. It was an actionable term. 3 minutes of measured breath 3 times a day. A practice of honest confession to a trusted companion. A commitment to small acts of restitution in one's immediate circle. He began to teach it in the shelter of the hospice, in Tom's classroom as a side seminar, and in a small weekly meeting at the community center where people were invited to bring doubts and practical problems rather than creeds. The community that grew around these practices was heterogeneous. People came who believed in the supernatural exactly as Scripture teaches, and people who carried no doctrinal frame at all. They found common ground in the practices, presence, care, and personal narrative ownership. For many, this was an unexpected form of liberation. For those whose identity had been bound to institutional authority, it offered a complement rather than a contradiction. James never presented the archive as a replacement theology. He offered it as a catalyzing metaphor for ordinary transformation. There were moments when the archive's projections demanded moral courage from him. A local pastor, respected and long-tenured, heard rumors and confronted James. Their conversation, held in the back room of a diner with grease and hymnals as companions, was at once tender and fraught. The pastor feared fragmentation. James feared the loss of small communities who relied on church structures for food and shelter. They negotiated in the conversation a practical line. James would not broadcast the archive. The pastor would not use rumor to harm people. Both would prioritize the vulnerable. These negotiated ethics are part of what the craft had shown could be possible when secrecy was tempered by human compassion.
The archive did not forbid institutions. It simply revealed their tendencies toward consolidation. James's response was to seek balance, neither demolition nor naive acceptance. There were moments when the archive's projections demanded moral courage from him. A local pastor, respected and long-tenured, heard rumors and confronted James. Their conversation, held in the back room of a diner with grease and hymnals as companions, was at once tender and fraught. The pastor feared fragmentation. James feared the loss of small communities who relied on church structures for food and shelter. They negotiated in the conversation a practical line. James would not broadcast the archive. The pastor would not use rumor to harm people. Both would prioritize the vulnerable. These negotiated ethics are part of what the craft had shown could be possible when secrecy was tempered by human compassion. The archive did not forbid institutions. It simply revealed their tendencies toward consolidation. James's response was to seek balance, neither demolition nor naive acceptance.
The projection's records had offered him a vantage point. His role was to steward the consequences with pity and discretion. Years passed. The craft's visits were intermittent. Sometimes James would go long stretches without a projection, and in those dry seasons, the practices he had helped plant carried themselves. People he had taught began to show small, sometimes surprising fruit. A man reconciled with a sister after decades of silence. A young woman deciding to train as a nurse because she had been held as if her life mattered. A community center that introduced a rotation of caregiving teams modeled after the archive's hints on responsibility. These were not headline conversions. They were the slow accrual of new moral economies. One night, decades into his stewardship and many projections later, the craft offered a final frame that James would carry for the rest of his days. The projection was simple. An older man sat in a quiet room surrounded by a small circle. Mary at his side, Sarah leaning to listen, friends who had carried him across years. The man's hands were those of a life lived with practical dignity, not theatrical triumph. The archive annotated the frame with the barest line, "Natural death attended." There were no trumpets, no apocalyptic signs. The projection's gravity was in its ordinariness. The record then offered a closing overlay, a mapping of what had occurred after the man's death, not in policy terms, but in human terms. The archive showed how a movement solidified, how institutions formalized doctrine, and how certain voices, especially feminine caretaking voices, were occasionally shunted to the margins. Yet the projection also showed the persistence of other forms of transmission, family practices, kitchen teachings, small rituals of presence that the archive rendered as living lineage. James let the images sit with him like weather. The projection did not tell him to abandon churches. It reminded him instead that revival could happen in kitchens and clinics as surely as in cathedrals. It suggested that resurrection might be better measured in lives restored, in people who reclaimed authorship of their spiritual destinies, than in a single cosmic event. That understanding rechanneled his energy. He redoubled practices that promoted ordinary revival, training caregivers, teaching basic antiseptic techniques coupled with tenderness, and supporting small community-led teachings that honored hidden voices. He insisted always on the archive's framing language when speaking, according to the record, within the projection, as the archive shows. He believed in humility, both toward believers who read doctrine as immutable and toward those who would use the archive's images as weapons. His last project before he aged into a quieter life was to create a pamphlet, short, sober, and practical. The pamphlet did not make claims about history. It summarized what he had learned from the archive's pedagogy. Tend wounds with competence and tenderness. Practice 3-day periods of reflective renewal as a method, not as a ritual requiring celestial verification. Listen to women's teaching without elevating anonymity into erasure, and share inconvenient truths with consent and context. He distributed the pamphlet in low numbers, paper copies in the hospice, a modest printout in Tom's classroom, and a digital version available by request. The craft's record suggested modest distribution as best practice. He kept his own copies in a drawer next to the memory stone that had started it all. In the years that followed, fragments of the projection continued to ripple. Some scholars, careful and not reckless, published articles asking provocative questions about narrative formation in early Christian communities. These were not claims of falsity, but rather invitations to nuance. Small communities took up practices of lived resurrection that, in the aggregate, made certain neighborhoods more resilient. Where James had worried about the weaponization of revelation, he saw instead a slow recomposition of ethical habits that made radical claims less urgent and loving practice more the norm. James died quietly at home, not in spectacle, but in a living room with a small circle of friends who had become family. The hospice-trained volunteers who had adopted Mary's bedside practices were there. They sang no anthem of triumph, they named no doctrine as all-sufficient. They held hands and acknowledged the ordinary miracle of a life tended well. The craft's memory, years in his pocket and in his head, had taught him how to steward something dangerous into something good. After his death, a few of the people he had influenced, Tom among them, spoke publicly, not to assert the archive's accuracy, but to speak about the ethic James had lived. Small acts of responsibility, an insistence on dignity, and the refusal to weaponize narrative. The world spun on. The archives of history continued to do their work, wrestling with evidence and with faith. Within James's community, however, something subtle had changed. People began to imagine resurrection as an ongoing act, daily, communal, and attainable. The craft remained in its hollow, and Sabir returned to the stars in time, its mission continuing across worlds. The archive's memory stones, distributed in protocol between species and those entrusted by them, remained a fragile technology, a possibility for illumination and a test for human tenderness. The record James had viewed remained, within the craft, a single node of memory among a vast ledger. It was not a proof block to be dropped without reflection. It was instead a lens through which one could see another human way of being. Those who encountered the story later often asked the same question. Did the projection prove that everything believed about resurrection was false? The answer, within this account, was not a binary. The archive's projection, according to the record, suggested that one historically plausible sequence involved survival and continued life. It also showed how nations and institutions shape meaning. But the projection did not erase meaning. It complicated it. And, perhaps more importantly, it offered an alternate invitation to practice resurrection in one's own life. James had learned to live that invitation, not as a polemic against institutions, but as a complement to faith, a pathway to reclaim individual spiritual authority. He had not sought to break churches. He had only wanted to preserve dignity, teach competence, and make sure the vulnerable were not collateral in the construction of myth. As the years settled, a pattern emerged among those who had followed James's stewardship. They cultivated practices that outlasted rumor. They taught children to do simple acts of healing and to hold their own stories with courage. They did not posture as a new sect. Instead, they practiced patient kindness, sought justice quietly, and encouraged internal sovereignty. The archive's ethical argument, disclose but do not destabilize, had converted into a social ethic that resembled what the projection had called lived resurrection. The last projection James ever asked for was not one that revised history further. It was a small frame of a child playing at a threshold. Sarah in the projection, older now, teaching a small child to bandage a scrape, to comfort, to tell the truth about one's feelings. The archive labeled the scene continuity. It was perhaps the projection's most persuasive claim, that ordinary people, learning small skills of care and narrative humility, could carry forward a different kind of authority than the one that accrues to institutions. This is the heart of the revelation James received after fixing the alien craft. Within the projection's account was not simply a historical reimagining, but a practical ethos, resurrection as a process, dignity in caregiving, and the preservation of marginalized voices. Those are not demands to tear down sacred structures. They are invitations to reclaim power within the small, daily acts of life. If this story stirred you, if the idea of resurrection as living practice resonates, there is more to explore. The pinned comment links to an ebook that gathers the practices James taught, with context and sources framed as according to the record, and as an ethical guide for those who want to learn careful stewardship. If you feel called to study the practical methods, healing dressings, the 3-day integration practices, the stewardship ethics, those resources provide a companion to the account told here. Ultimately, whether the projection is read as literal, allegorical, or somewhere in between, the invitation is the same. Reclaim your small authority. Tend wounds. Teach quietly. Share truth with care. Live resurrection not only as a doctrine remembered on a single day, but as a life redeemed a little at a time, through ordinary sacred acts that refuse spectacle and choose steadiness. James had fixed a craft that night on his ridge, and in doing so, he had been shown a record that reframed a great story. The greatest shock, in the end, was not that history might be more complicated than the stories we inherited. It was that the possibility of resurrection could belong to anyone who chose, each morning, to live with tenderness and responsibility. James had fixed a craft that night on his ridge, and in doing so, he had been shown a record that reframed a great story. The greatest shock, in the end, was not that history might be more complicated than the stories we inherited. It was that the possibility of resurrection could belong to anyone who chose, each morning, to live with tenderness and responsibility.